This is North Korea. It's a country that should have collapsed a dozen times over through the last few decades. It's been cut off from global trade, targeted by almost global sanctions, and hit by one of the worst famines in modern history. Yet, against all odds, it's still here. Since its very existence in 1948, every prediction of its downfall has been wrong. The Soviet Union fell, Yugoslavia fell, Mao's China transformed, but the Kim family dynasty has endured, thrived even, and is very much in control. So how has a regime like this actually survived? What makes North Korea so resistant to collapse when every historical and economic idea says it shouldn't even exist? Well, to understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to how this system was built in the first place. In 1945, after Japan's defeat in World War II, the Korean peninsula was split in two. The Soviets took the north, the Americans took the south. And out of that chaos came Kim Il-sung, a 33-year-old guerrilla fighter who'd spent years fighting the Japanese with Chinese communists in the 30s, then later joined the Soviet Red Army in the 40s. Now, with Moscow's full backing, he became the hand-picked leader of the new North Korean state. From the start, everything about this country was built with outside help. The Soviets sent advisors, weapons, and money. They trained North Korean officers, helped write its constitution, and poured in the machinery needed to rebuild. But that new system was tested almost immediately. In 1950, Kim Il-sung launched an invasion of the South to reunify the peninsula by force. It backfired. Within weeks, US-led forces had pushed deep into the north, and Kim's regime was on the verge of collapse. This is probably the first instance in which the Kim dynasty could have been deposed or the country fall into civil war, like how the Russian Empire's defeat in World War I ultimately led to the Russian Revolution. But luckily for them, China stepped in. More than 2 million Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River, driving US and South Korean forces back to the 38th parallel, saving the North Koreans' existence. The USSR also provided covert backing as they didn't want to get involved against the US. Now, they did this for a few reasons, and it really establishes the importance of just the existence of North Korea. See, if North Korea fell completely, American troops would be stationed right on China's border. For the Soviets, this was about containing US influence and expanding communist ideology in Asia during the Cold War. After the war ended in 1953, both China and the Soviet Union poured resources back into the North once again. It was during this time that Kim Il-sung would develop the two thought processes that would define North Korea to this very day. Kim didn't want his country to have to rely on help from other countries forever, so he developed the ideology of Juche, emphasizing complete self-reliance in everything. This thought process was further reinforced by what became known as the August Faction Incident, when Kim purged pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions from the Workers' Party, following their attempt to remove him from power and accuse him of becoming a dictator. Today, the Juche ideology is the main reason why North Korea is described as the Hermit Kingdom, a country that doesn't want anyone's help. But at the same time, Kim Il-sung knew the strategic importance of his country. See, as long as North Korea sat between two communist giants, the world number 2 and 3 powers at the time, then it could play off them to their benefit, since their very survival is beneficial to them. So, funnily enough, North Korea, despite technically having the state ideology of Juche, wasn't really isolationist at all when you look deeper into things. Let me explain. While Russia and China are today often portrayed as natural allies against the West, their relationship hasn't always been so straightforward. In the early 1960s, their partnership fractured over competing visions of socialism, a divide that would become known as the Sino-Soviet split. For a small country wedged between these two superpowers, North Korea had to be calculated to not only survive, but thrive. It was still receiving aid from both sides, and Kim couldn't afford to alienate either of them. So at least publicly, Pyongyang adopted a position of neutrality. But neutrality during the times of the Cold War rarely meant staying unnoticed. Both Moscow and Beijing closely watched North Korea's behavior, and it didn't take long to see which way it leaned. Pyongyang's newspapers were echoing Chinese slogans, denouncing big power chauvinism, a phrase aimed only at the Soviets. Ideologically too, North Korea found itself aligned more with Mao's China than with Khrushchev's USSR. As a result, the Soviets massively cut back on their support, leaving the Chinese to fill much of the gap. Yet this balance didn't last. By the mid-1960s, China was descending into the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, while the Soviet Union, now under Leonid Brezhnev, offered stability. Kim Il-sung quickly restored ties with Moscow, ditching a China that could no longer afford to help them. The USSR's vast energy reserves, heavy machinery, and industrial know-how kept Pyongyang's planned economy running, and for a time, even thriving. During this period, North Korea was actually outperforming the South. Sort of. It's hard to imagine now, with South Korea's GDP sitting at around $1.7 trillion compared to the North's tiny $26 billion, a staggering 65-to-1 gap. But in the decades right after the Korean War, the situation was reversed. Back then, North Korea was the more industrialized half of the peninsula, largely thanks to heavy Soviet and Chinese aid. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that South Korea's rapid export-driven growth finally pushed it ahead of the North. Things rapidly started to change as the Soviet Union was getting weaker and weaker in the lead-up to its eventual collapse. They started to reduce things like the Friendship Prices program in 1988, a policy that had allowed Allied states to buy oil, fertilizer, and raw materials at massively discounted rates. Nearly all of North Korea's commodities came from this program because they were unaffordable outside of it. So once the Soviet Union collapsed completely in 1991, so did the entire program with it. And basically that led to North Korea beginning to collapse too. But there were a few other reasons as well. To begin with, North Korea's farms were some of the least productive in the world. Kim Il-sung obsessed over heavy industry and city prestige, pouring resources into Pyongyang instead of agriculture. Farm equipment was outdated. The first North Korean tractor, built in the 1950s, had roughly the horsepower of a Western lawnmower at the time. Even decades later, those same machines were still running. Everything was collectivized, and farmers had no incentive to work harder than their quota. Anything extra went straight to the state, so they did what people always do under bad systems: the bare minimum to survive. North Korea also developed a reputation for never repaying the countries that lent it money or sold it valuable goods. Naturally, the number of nations willing to do business with it shrank fast. Sweden still hasn't been repaid for 1,000 Volvos it sold North Korea in 1974, and the interest has racked up to $322 million, a debt that technically makes Stockholm one of Pyongyang's oldest creditors. So what followed was the country's worst crisis yet, the 1990s famine, known as the Arduous March. It was one of the deadliest famines in modern history. Somewhere between 240,000 and 3 million people died between 1995 and 2000. It was at this time that North Korea came the closest to what we'd call collapsing. But surprisingly, it didn't. This timing was absolutely crucial to their survival. Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, before the famine hit its worst phase, allowed his son, Kim Jong-il, to inherit power under relatively controlled conditions. It also kept Senior Kim's image untarnished, since he would have been blamed for the catastrophe if he was alive for it. Kim Il-sung had spent years ensuring a smooth transfer of power for his son, gradually elevating Kim Jong-il within the party and military, and purging any figures who could threaten his succession. Through propaganda, Kim Jong-il was portrayed as an almost divine leader-in-waiting, the dear leader destined to continue his father's revolutionary legacy. But there was one major alleged coup attempt that happened during the famine. While the date of it is unclear, we know it was sometime between 1995 and 97, having to do with the 6th Corps of the North Korean People's Army. It's said that the leadership of the division were angered by the decision of the government to not send food to the Hamgyong provinces. The intention was to take over the Kongjin port, a university, communication center, and missile installations before linking up with the neighboring 7th Corps and marching on Pyongyang. But the coup failed because the KPA's internal power-sharing system, requiring consensus between military, political, and security branches, made it practically impossible for any single officer to mobilize troops independently. The system was intentionally designed to prevent exactly that kind of rebellion. So it was discovered before it could be carried out, and completely dismantled. This is part of a broader set of restrictions on North Korea that the Kim family put in place from the very beginning to control everything. Information was locked down. No one knew how bad things really were outside of their own town. There were no unions, no local authorities, no independent media, nothing that could form a base for rebellion. To make sure no one could ever challenge that system, surveillance went up everywhere. The ministries of people's security tracked conversations, letters, even family gossip. North Korean citizens couldn't even freely travel within their country, let alone outside of it. Most people genuinely believe that things are worse everywhere else, that the Kim family is all that stands between them and chaos. All these things are still happening today, and it's why they're considered to have the worst human rights record in the world. It's for these reasons there weren't really any risks during the most volatile time in their history. Even the US is recorded to have thought so at this time. But during the famine, the senior party members and military elite were still doing well, and they didn't want to risk jeopardizing that not just for themselves, but for their families. See, North Korea's rigid class system, known as Songbun, ensured that loyalty was rewarded, and disloyalty destroyed not just your life, but your lineage. Under Songbun, every North Korean is classified based on their family's political history, which can determine jobs you can hold, what food you can receive, and even if your children are allowed to attend university. But the most chilling aspect of it is North Korea's policy of guilt by association. The idea that punishment extends for 3 generations. So if someone committed a political crime, then their parents and children can be imprisoned or executed alongside them. Meanwhile, the party's inability to distribute adequate food to lower-ranking people and normal citizens, as well as the unjust distribution to senior party members, established an every man for himself mindset amongst North Koreans. The relaxation of border security due to guards also being too malnourished to care led to many citizens fleeing the country. In fact, guards saw this as an opportunity to extort escapees for money, food, and other forms of bribery, despite Kim Jong-il's attempts to clamp down on these types of things. But this was, on a personal level, way easier and less risky compared to organizing a protest against the Kim regime. The focus was just on surviving, not protesting. So how did Pyongyang come through this? Well, for starters, they shifted back to relying on China for support since Russia was now having to build itself back up. But it also relied on aid from the UN, US, and South Korea. Now at this point, you might be wondering why the West would be helping them. And no, it's not just out of the kindness of their hearts. But the reality is that these countries actually don't want North Korea to collapse either. Let me explain. Under South Korean law, all North Koreans are rightful citizens of the South as well, since South Korea doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the North Korean government. So if North Korea suddenly collapses, then they'd face the real possibility of gaining over 26 million new citizens in the space of a few days, which is a situation no country is prepared to handle. And yes, even if they changed the constitution, this situation would probably still happen. A unification would be madness, since if you were to compare it to the German reunification of the East and West, which was already a miracle, a Korean one would be way more complex and expensive. We've never seen the unification of 2 countries so different in terms of their economic power and culture. The cost would be at least a few $1 trillion. China would also probably get a significant number of North Korean refugees, which they wouldn't want to absorb either. Meanwhile, for the US, a collapsed state having nukes is just a very scary situation to be in. Geopolitically, they're basically protected by mutual inconvenience. So they were helped by the West, and slowly but surely came out of it after a few years. It's very important to understand here that revolutions don't usually happen in response to countries being poor and repressive as they do in dramatic fiction. The Soviet Union didn't have the worst economy in the world when they collapsed. Many African countries today even have it a lot worse than they did and are still standing. China didn't collapse during the Great Leap Forward when millions were dying of hunger. Yet on the contrary, both the British and French empires collapsed when they were relatively rich, even in the midst of post-war economic growth. To some, the answer is simply that you can have a terrible economy and survive as a country, but not a terrible economy and support an empire. Which is true, of course, but not everything. In reality, many fall when the government is weak and people see the possibility of change. The Soviet Union didn't have a supreme leader after Stalin. Yugoslavia didn't have someone like Tito. And by the way, I'm not saying these people were good leaders, like at all, don't get me wrong, but they were anchors of authority, and once they were gone, the whole structure started to come apart. As we get to the North's transition of power to Kim Jong-un, concerns about instability and collapse resurfaced. The succession process came quickly after Kim Jong-il suffered a major stroke in August 2008. Kim Jong-un was only officially unveiled as successor 2 years later when he was made a 4-star general, and just a year after that, Kim Jong-il died in December 2011. So he only had a year to prepare for his ascension, unlike his father who had decades. Again at this time, some experts considered a North Korean collapse a reasonable probability. In fact, during military exercises in 2013, US and South Korean forces conducted scenarios to prepare for such an event. But Kim Jong-un carried out massive purges, estimated to be 44% of the country's top officials, to consolidate authority like his father and grandfather did before him, the most dramatic being the execution of his uncle, Jang Song-taek, in December 2013. Kim Jong-un has had different challenges than his predecessors when it comes to keeping North Korea stable, and it's mostly centered around navigating almost complete sanctions. Technically, North Korea has been sanctioned in some form since the 50s, but it really picked up from 2006 when they conducted their first underground nuclear test, resulting in an arms embargo. I should quickly note here though that this was a pivotal moment, as it meant North Korea now can't collapse via foreign intervention due to having nuclear deterrence. Even if they're weaker than the US, if they have nukes, that's all they need for protection. But anyways, it was really in 2013, with their third nuclear test and first under Kim Jong-un, that it really began to develop into what it is today. UN resolutions 2087 and 2094 banned bulk cash transfers, targeted financial institutions and foreign banks tied to them, restricted precious metals trade, and really began to hurt them economically. The last major sanctions that were adopted by the UN were in 2017, with resolutions 2371, 2375, and 2397, which basically extended to a full economic siege. Oil and petroleum caps were restricted. Overseas labor revenue was banned. All joint investments were shut down. In short, North Korea lost roughly 90% of its legal exports and virtually all access to global finance. The world was trying to shut down their entire economy. Yet, here we are today, and North Korea is still alive. So what's happened? Well, they adapted. Pyongyang built an underground economy that survives on illicit activity, the most famous of them being cybercrime. Since around 2014, North Korea has developed a new and highly lucrative source of income: state-sponsored cybercrime. At the center of these operations is Bureau 121, the cyber warfare arm of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, North Korea's powerful intelligence agency. Its hackers routinely target banks, cryptocurrency exchanges, government institutions, and private companies across the world. The most notorious of these units is the Lazarus Group, responsible for some of the largest digital heists in history. In 2025 alone, they stole more than $2 billion, up from $1.34 billion in 2024, a 103% increase from the previous year, and that total keeps rising. Under Kim Jong-un, North Korea has effectively become the world's most aggressive state-sponsored cyber threat to global financial systems. Through it all, China has been helping North Korea circumvent the sanctions through front companies, maritime evasion, border smuggling, Chinese banks, and so on. They account for roughly 98% of North Korea's total trade, meaning they basically carry the country, to their benefit of course of keeping them dependent on them. Remember, China and North Korea are not friends. They see it as a buffer state between the heavily US-allied South Korea and them. Lately though, North Korea and Russia's partnership has gotten much deeper, as now both countries have become isolated on the international level, due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Pyongyang now provides roughly 40% of Russia's ammunition supply for the war, millions of artillery shells, thousands of troops, and hundreds of missiles valued at around $10 billion in arms, and more than $20 billion in total wartime benefits. In exchange, Moscow sends oil, food, and provides diplomatic protection at the UN. It's turned into a mutually beneficial alliance for both regimes. As of now, things seem to be looking up for the Hermit Kingdom. In May 2025, the US Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that North Korea was in its strongest strategic position in decades. Kim Jong-un's decision to back Russia in its war against Ukraine has significantly elevated Pyongyang's global standing, to say the least. During a speech marking the 80th anniversary of the Workers' Party of Korea, Kim pledged to turn the nation into the best socialist paradise in the world. That goal may remain far out of reach, given, well, everything, but it will be fascinating to watch how North Korea's stability continues to evolve in the years ahead. The stability of the North Korean regime is something that eludes even Korean scholars, in essence because it falls outside of the normal political science framework in understanding what exactly motivates this inefficient system to continue garnering support, if it even has any. But yet, it works. If something did happen to Kim Jong-un, even with him lacking a clearly designated successor, it's not fully guaranteed the country would collapse. There is evidence to suggest that his sister, Kim Yo-jong, has been prepared to take over in the event something happens to him. With her being present during her brother's rise to power, she's definitely familiar with the potential brutal methods required to maintain her leadership. Dynasties have always been a normal part of human history though. Sometimes they last hundreds of years. And for now, the Kims have never lost control. Thank you for watching.